Our reading this morning begins at the end of what had been an eventful day in the life of Jesus and his disciples. Earlier that same day, Jesus had been given the news that his relative and childhood playmate, John the Baptist, had been beheaded. Grief-stricken, he sought a place where he could be on his own to mourn. But a large crowd followed him, and Jesus, moved to compassion by their need, set aside his own desire for solitude to teach them and to heal their sick. As evening approached, knowing they were hungry and would have a long walk back home, he asked the disciples to find food for them. And that's where we have the story from last Sunday of the feeding of the 5,000. Only after the crowd had had their fill and all the leftovers had been gathered up, do we read that Jesus, dismissing the crowd and telling his disciples to go ahead of him by boat, was finally able to climb the hills surrounding the Sea of Galilee and spend time in prayer and mourning. By then it was well and truly night, and the disciples were sailing back across the water. The Sea of Galilee is really a large lake, not a sea. It's 13 miles long by 8 miles wide, with a 33-mile circumference. It is the lowest freshwater lake on Earth, and due to its low-lying position in the Rift Valley, it is subject to sudden and severe storms. This is what happened to the disciples. As they headed back, a strong wind blew up, and they, experienced fishermen though they were struggling to make any headway. It is at that point, in the fourth watch of the night, sometime between 3 and 6 a.m., that Jesus appeared, walking on the water towards them. In their hour of need, Jesus came to the disciples, just as he comes to us when we are struggling against the stormy seas of life, and cry out to him for rescue. His words to them, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid," are words that we need to hear in our own lives. The question we must ask ourselves is, how do we react in the storms of life? Do we, like Peter, leap into action only to find ourselves sinking when we realize that the situation we face is overwhelming? Or do we stay in what we see as the relative safety of the boat, only to find ourselves relentlessly tossed about? Do we try to suppress our anxieties, hoping they won't bother us, only to have them loom larger than life in the small, wakeful hours of the night? Do we fret and worry, but feel unable to change things because the course of action necessary to do so calls for more courage than we feel able to muster? Life is often like that, isn't it? And so too is our Christian journey. We want to follow Jesus, but sometimes it calls for more from us than we feel able to give. At such times, we might find ourselves asking, was Peter's way the best way, the courageous option, or was he being foolhardy? Well, in my opinion, there's only one answer to that question. Remember, there were 11 other disciples in the boat, but it was only Peter who dared get out and tried to walk towards Jesus. And what's more, he would have too, if he hadn't suddenly become aware of the wind and realized what he was doing. In that moment, his faith failed him, and he began to sink. But he cried out to Jesus, and Jesus reached out his hand and pulled Peter to safety. In life, when times get hard, when we're battered by difficulties, doubts, or anxieties, we need to fix our eyes on Jesus. When we're afraid we're sinking, we need to call out to Jesus, just like Peter did, and he will come to our rescue. There's a book by John Ortberg which has a fantastic title. It's called "If You Want to Walk on Water, You've Got to Get Out of the Boat." What's inside the book is excellent too, and I would heartily recommend it. But it's a tension-seeking title that has always stayed with me. It's grabbed me because it's so true. While we stay safe, if somewhat uncomfortably, in the boat, nothing changes. We don't grow. We don't take a risk. We don't get out of our comfort zone. And we don't get to experience something remarkable that comes with answering Jesus' call to us. Peter knew it was impossible to walk on water. He knew it, but he went for it anyway. There are times when it seems that Jesus asks the impossible of us. How can we do the task he calls us to? We try to live God's way. We try to bring his justice, peace, and love to this world. But it's as if we're confronted with waves too big to master. We know that it is impossible for us to lead the Christian life in our own strength, but we try anyway. We hear Jesus calling and we answer. We get out of the boat and we go towards him, but then it all goes wrong. The wind had been there all along, but suddenly Peter became aware of it, aware of this crazy thing he was doing. And that's when fear and doubt overcame him. He took his eyes off Jesus and he began to sink, which is exactly the sort of thing that happens to us. It's all about trusting in God. We need to trust in him, but how? In the midst of all that is going on in our lives, how do we hear him speak comfort and courage to us? Do you remember the story of Elijah and the still small voice of calm? How can we hear the voice of God when he's whispering our name? Well, we must find quiet times to listen, time to hear his voice, which otherwise is in danger of being drowned out by the noise and rush of life. Think of Jesus' example from today's reading and how he sought out some quiet time to be with his Father in quiet, solitary prayer. I think that that's the challenge for us from today's passage. Jesus calls us. He calls each one of us to follow him. And in those times when the water is still and flat like a mill pond, and in those times when we're facing the wind and the waves, he asks us to get out of the boat, to take a risk. And above all, he asks us to trust him. To do that, we need to hear his voice and to know that he is near. We need to know that in our fear, he will rescue us. And that trust and relationship can only grow if we cultivate the habit of prayer. It doesn't have to be long and wordy. It can be as simple as we like. In simplicity, there is often profundity. And in the midst of our prayer, we need to give God the gift of our silence so that he can fill it with his whisper, with his still, small voice that speaks into the very depths of our souls. So, I invite you to give him a little of that time right now as we listen to the song, Be Still, after which we will share in a time of prayer together.